I was in my second year of college when it happened. I had just moved into a small rental house a few blocks from campus, the kind of place you'd expect a student to live. Cheap, old, with doors that didn't quite close right, and floors that creaked in random places. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I liked the independence, the quiet. My roommate from freshman year had transferred, and I figured I'd be fine living alone. At first, everything was normal. Classes, late-night study sessions, instant ramen dinners. But after a few weeks, I started getting that feeling. You know the one, like someone's watching you. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. It was a new place, after all. Maybe I just wasn't used to the silence. Then, little things started happening. I'd come home to find my kitchen chairs slightly pulled out, just enough to make me second-guess myself. My books would be shuffled on my desk, even though I knew I hadn't touched them. But the worst was the smell. Every so often near my living room window, I'd catch the faintest whiff of cigarette smoke. I didn't smoke, and my neighbors were older, the type to complain about noise at 9 p.m., not hang around outside my house smoking. It would come and go, never strong, but enough to make me feel uneasy. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone walking by. Maybe my imagination. Then I saw him. It was late, maybe around midnight. I had just taken out the trash, dragging the bin down my narrow driveway to the curb. As I turned to go back inside, I caught movement in the alley behind my house. A man, just standing there, half in shadow, half in the glow of the street lamp. He wasn't doing anything, just standing, watching. I froze for a second, heart hammering. But then, just as quickly as I had seen him, I forced myself to look away. I didn't want to seem paranoid, didn't want to make eye contact. I walked back inside, locked the door, and convinced myself it was nothing. Just some guy passing through. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made my skin crawl. The wind against the window, the pipes settling, the faint creak of the house shifting. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that my brain was turning a random guy in an alley into something sinister. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My back door, locked before I went to bed, was slightly ajar, just an inch, enough to see the darkness beyond. My hands were shaking as I pushed it shut, flipped the lock, and checked every room. Everything looked normal. But when I stepped outside to breathe, to calm myself down, I saw them. Muddy footprints, leading up to my bedroom window. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the footprints. They were deep, uneven, like whoever made them had been standing there for a long time, shifting their weight. My stomach turned. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had been right there, just outside my window while I was sleeping. I looked up at the glass, trying to imagine what he had seen. My curtains weren't thick. If the moon was out, or if I had left my bedside lamp on, he could have seen everything. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to believe this was some kind of mistake, that maybe a stray dog or a drunk neighbor had wandered too close. But deep down, I knew better. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe I had forgotten to lock the door. Maybe the footprints were old, just now noticeable because of the morning dew. I even called my best friend, Emily, and laughed it off while I told her. I probably just freaked myself out, I said, forcing a chuckle. But even as I said it, my eyes kept drifting back to the door. I didn't feel safe. That night, I double-checked every lock, closed every curtain, and wedged a chair under the doorknob, something my mom used to do when she was home alone. It felt silly, but it helped. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise. A soft scraping sound like something dragging against wood. I held my breath, straining to hear. It was coming from outside, near my window. My pulse pounded in my ears. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the screen, using the dim light to check the time. I wanted to believe it was just the wind, but then it came again. Longer this time. A slow, deliberate scrape, followed by a pause. My throat went dry. Someone was there. Someone was right outside my window. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen. 5 minutes? 10? My body refused to move, like any sudden motion would let him know I was awake. Then, just when I thought the silence had stretched too long, I heard it. The faintest tap against the glass. Not loud, not urgent, just testing. My breath caught in my throat. He was right there, inches away from me, separated only by a thin pane of glass. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but all I could do was squeeze my eyes shut and pray he would go away. I don't know how long I lay there, listening. My whole body was tense, every muscle locked in place as I waited for the next sound, the next tap. But after a while, the silence stretched too long. I opened my eyes, barely breathing. My room was dark, but my window was framed by the faint orange glow of the street lamp outside. I wanted to look. I didn't want to look. My hands were clammy as I gripped my phone, my thumb hovering over the emergency dial. Then, just when I thought maybe he was gone, the floor creaked. Not inside my room, not even in the house, but outside, right beneath my window. That was enough. I bolted upright, barely suppressing a gasp. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I typed out a message to Emily first, something short and panicked. "Someone is outside my house." Before I could hit send, I heard movement again. Slow footsteps, moving away this time, disappearing into the night. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. The silence was worse than the sound. Because now I didn't know where he was. I didn't sleep. I sat in my bed, hugging my knees, waiting for the sun to rise. As soon as it did, I forced myself to go outside. I needed proof. I needed to know I wasn't imagining things, and I found it. More footprints, deeper this time, circling the house. But there was something else too. Scratches on my window frame. Long, jagged marks, as if someone had dragged something sharp across the wood. My stomach lurched. That was the sound I had heard last night. He had been trying to open the window. I called my landlord that morning and told him I was breaking the lease. I didn't care about the deposit, didn't care about anything except getting out. 2 days later, I moved in with Emily. I never went back to that house. Sometimes I think about that night, about the footprints, the cigarette smoke, the slow, deliberate scrape against my window, and I wonder how long he had been watching before I ever noticed. When my girlfriend Emily and I found the apartment, it felt like a steal. A spacious one-bedroom in an older but well-kept complex just outside the city, for half the price of anything else we had seen. The landlord, Mr. Hayes, was an old guy with thick glasses who seemed almost surprised we wanted to move in. He mentioned something about long-term vacancies in the building, but we didn't care. It was quiet, affordable, and close to Emily's job. We signed the lease that same day and moved in the following weekend. At first, everything was perfect. No loud neighbors, no weird smells, just the occasional creak from the old wooden floors. About a week in, we started noticing noises at night. It was never anything loud, just faint, almost deliberate sounds coming from the apartment above us. Slow footsteps like someone pacing. Once or twice, I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor, but always in short bursts, never enough to be disruptive. "Probably just the pipes," Emily said, shrugging it off. "Old buildings make weird noises." I wanted to believe that, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I could swear I heard a chair creaking, as if someone was sitting just above us, shifting their weight. Curiosity got the best of me after a few days. While taking out the trash, I ran into Mr. Hayes in the hallway and casually asked about our upstairs neighbor. His response made my stomach tighten. "Oh, that unit's been empty for months," he said, shaking his head. "Last tenant moved out in May. You hear something up there?" I hesitated before brushing it off. "Nah, just wondering." I could feel my pulse in my ears as I walked back inside. I told Emily what he said, and for the first time she looked unsettled. "Maybe it's just the building settling," she suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. That night, the noises came back, clearer this time. Footsteps, slow and steady, moving directly above our bedroom. Then, the unmistakable sound of a chair creaking again. Emily squeezed my hand under the covers, both of us holding our breath. We tried to convince ourselves it was nothing, but then, around 3 a.m., I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ceiling access panel, the one we had barely paid attention to before, was slightly open, just enough to see a sliver of darkness inside. I was about to whisper to Emily when I saw it. 2 eyes, barely visible in the dim light, staring down at us. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The shadows, the poor lighting. I wanted to believe I was imagining things. But then the eyes blinked. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt Emily tense beside me. She must have seen it too. Neither of us moved. I couldn't even bring myself to speak. My entire body felt frozen, locked in place by the sheer, overwhelming terror of knowing that something, or someone, was up there, looking right at us. Then, without a sound, the eyes vanished, and the panel shifted back into place, as if whoever was up there had retreated into the darkness. Emily let out a shaky breath, gripping my arm so tightly it hurt. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, still staring at the ceiling. My mind was racing. Who the hell was up there? And how long had they been watching us? I wanted to believe it was just some horrible misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew better. My instincts screamed that we weren't alone in our own apartment. "We have to get out," Emily said, already fumbling for her phone. But my pride, or maybe just sheer denial, made me hesitate. "Let's check first," I whispered. "If someone's actually up there, we need to know." I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I expected to find the panel empty, to reassure ourselves that we were overreacting. Maybe I just didn't want to admit how scared I was. Either way, I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, dragged it under the ceiling panel, and climbed up. My hands trembled as I reached for the edge, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. The attic space was pitch black, the air thick with dust and something else. Something stale. The smell of old wood, sweat, and something faintly sour. I held my breath and strained my eyes against the dark. Then I saw it. Not a person. Not a rat or some wild animal. Something worse. A nest. A small makeshift space with blankets, empty food wrappers, and crumpled water bottles shoved into the corners. Someone had been living up there, watching us, listening. My stomach turned as I took in the sight. The blankets were grimy, flattened from use, and the wrappers were recent. Some still had crumbs inside. Someone had been up here, and not just briefly. They had been staying here, hiding above us. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine as I imagined them lying there, silent, listening to every conversation, every movement we made. The thought made me dizzy. I forced myself to look around, searching for any sign of who they were or where they might be now. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. A Polaroid photo, half buried under a pile of discarded clothes. My fingers shook as I pulled it free, turning it toward the dim glow from the bedroom below. It was a picture of Emily and me, taken from above. The angle was unmistakable. It had been shot through the access panel, capturing us asleep in bed. My mouth went dry. How many nights had they been watching? I wanted to vomit. My body screamed at me to get out of that attic, to run. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond the nest, I heard it. A slow, deliberate exhale. I nearly fell off the chair, scrambling down. "Go!" I gasped, barely able to form words. "Now!" Emily didn't ask questions. She grabbed our keys, our phones, and bolted for the door. I was right behind her, slamming the door shut behind us as we ran down the hall. My heart pounded as I fumbled with my phone, trying to call 911 while we sprinted toward the building's entrance. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely type. We didn't stop running until we were standing outside in the cold night air, both of us gasping for breath. The dispatcher answered just as I turned to look up at our apartment window. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, barely visible against the dim glow of our bedroom light, moving away from the ceiling panel. Whoever they were, they had been watching the whole time. The police arrived within minutes. 2 officers met us outside, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern as we told them what had happened. They didn't hesitate. Guns drawn, they headed inside while we waited in the cold, clutching each other like our lives depended on it. Every second felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes on our window, half expecting to see that shadow move again. But nothing happened. The apartment remained eerily still, like whoever had been up there had simply vanished. When the officers came back out, their faces were grim. "The attic space is empty," one of them said. "Whoever was up there is gone." My stomach dropped. I had hoped they'd find someone, hoped they'd drag some deranged squatter out in cuffs, something that would make all of this feel real, like it had an explanation. But there was nothing. No forced entry, no sign of where they had gone. Just that disgusting nest, the food wrappers, and the Polaroid. They bagged it as evidence, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't think they'd catch whoever did this. We didn't go back inside. The officers stayed with us while we grabbed the essentials: wallets, clothes, anything we could fit into a duffel bag in 5 minutes. I refused to look up at the ceiling panel again. I couldn't. The idea that someone might still be up there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for us to come back, made my skin crawl. As soon as we were packed, we left. We checked into a motel that night, and by morning we had already called the landlord to break our lease. Mr. Hayes didn't even seem surprised. He sighed, muttered something about how he thought that had stopped, and agreed to let us go without a penalty. That alone told me everything I needed to know. We weren't the first. I didn't ask him for details. I didn't want to know. We moved out that same day, leaving behind whatever furniture we couldn't fit in our car. I didn't care. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about it. About those eyes watching us from the ceiling. About that slow exhale in the attic. The worst part is not knowing how long they were up there. How many nights they had been watching us sleep. I check the ceiling of every place we stay now. Every single time. And I don't think I'll ever stop. I was in town for work, just a 2-month contract at a company that needed extra hands for a big project. It wasn't anything glamorous, just IT support, troubleshooting systems, fixing network issues. The pay was good though, and they covered my stay in a small short-term rental downtown. The place was nice enough, clean, modern, with a little balcony overlooking the street. It felt a bit impersonal, like no one had really lived there, but I didn't mind. I wasn't there to settle in, just to work, eat, sleep, and repeat. The first week went by without a hitch, long days at the office, late-night takeout, and passing out as soon as my head hit the pillow. But by the second week, I started noticing little things. At first, they were so small I barely registered them. My phone charger was unplugged when I was sure I'd left it in the socket. My closet door would be slightly open when I knew for a fact I had closed it. Once I came home and the air smelled different, like someone else's cologne. Sharp, musky, not anything I owned. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I'd unplugged the charger without thinking. Maybe the closet door just hadn't latched properly. And the cologne could have been lingering from a past guest. The rental was a revolving door of short-term tenants, after all. I forced myself to stop overanalyzing, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Every night, as I lay in bed, I found myself listening, straining to hear something out of place. A creak in the hallway, a faint shuffle. My mind told me it was the old building settling, the city noises filtering through the walls. Still, something in my gut felt off. The final straw was waking up one morning to find my living room lamp turned on. I never left it on overnight. And yet, there it was, casting a dull glow over the room like a silent accusation. I felt a chill run through me. That was the moment I stopped making excuses. I went online and ordered a cheap doorbell camera. It wasn't high-end, just something to give me peace of mind. I installed it that evening, making sure it was angled to capture the front door clearly. The app on my phone would notify me of any movement, so I told myself I'd have an answer soon enough. The first night, nothing. The second night, a stray cat wandered past the door. Normal. But on the third night, at 3:12 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. Groggy, I reached for it, expecting another cat, or maybe a car's headlights triggering the sensor. But when I opened the app and played the footage, my blood ran cold. The video showed my front door. Nothing at first, just the dimly lit hallway outside. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the doorknob twisted. Not forcefully, not like someone was trying to break in, but smoothly, like whoever was on the other side knew exactly what they were doing. A second later, the deadbolt slid open. My stomach dropped. Someone had a key. I watched in frozen horror as the door eased open just an inch. The footage didn't show much beyond the threshold, just darkness beyond the doorway. And then, as if sensing they were being recorded, the door slowly clicked shut again. I sat there staring at the screen, heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced through possibilities. A previous tenant? The landlord? A maintenance worker? But why would anyone be entering in the middle of the night? And why wouldn't they come all the way inside? I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There was no crime, no forced entry. Just a door unlocking on its own. Except it wasn't on its own. Someone had a key, and they had used it before. I thought about the charger, the closet door, the cologne. How many times had they been inside while I was asleep? I barely slept that night, lying in bed with my heart pounding at every creak and rustle. By morning, I'd convinced myself I couldn't stay there another night without answers. I called the rental company, pretending I had lost my key and needed a new one. The guy on the phone, some bored-sounding rep, was barely paying attention. "Oh, no worries, man," he said. "We keep extras at the office. Just swing by and grab one." My stomach twisted. "Extras?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, we have spares for all the units. Landlord keeps a set too, in case of emergencies." My mouth felt dry. "Anyone else?" I asked. There was a pause. "Nah, just us and the cleaning crew." Cleaning crew. But no one had cleaned my unit since I arrived. I hung up and sat there gripping my phone. There was no way to know who had been using the key. And even worse, there was no way to know if they would stop. I needed to get out. That evening, I packed up my stuff and booked a hotel across town. Before leaving, I set up my phone to record a time-lapse of the front door, propped up on the kitchen counter. I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking, and left the apartment for the last time. The next morning, curiosity got the best of me. I checked the footage, and there it was. At 3:12 a.m., just like before, the door unlocked. But this time, the person stepped inside. The figure moved cautiously, like they were expecting someone to be there. The camera angle wasn't great, but I could make out a man, tall, slim, wearing dark clothes. He didn't turn on any lights. Instead, he stood in the doorway for a moment as if listening. Then he stepped further inside. My breath caught as I watched him move toward the bedroom. My bedroom. My empty bed. He stood there for what felt like forever, just staring. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. It was small, metallic. I squinted at the screen, my stomach twisting. A key. Another one. I had no idea what it was for, but the thought of him carrying around extra keys, like he had access to more than just my unit, made my skin crawl. He didn't steal anything. He didn't even look around. He just lingered, like he was soaking it in, taking his time. Then, just as smoothly as he entered, he walked back to the door, locked it behind him, and disappeared into the night. I called the rental company the next morning, furious, demanding answers. They brushed me off, said they'd look into it, but assured me it was probably just a mistake with a cleaner having the wrong unit. I didn't believe them. No cleaner skulks around at 3 a.m. without turning on lights. No cleaner stands over someone's bed. I filed a police report, but they couldn't do much. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen. Just a man with a key. I never went back. Left some of my stuff behind, didn't care. I still think about it sometimes, about the way he just stood there, staring. About how many times he had done it before I noticed. About what would have happened if I hadn't left that night. And worst of all, I think about the key. The one he carried in his pocket. Because if he had one for my place, how many others did he have? How many other doors had he unlocked in the dead of night? I was never the paranoid type. I lived alone, but I had a security system, cameras, and a fenced-in backyard. My neighborhood was quiet, the kind where people walked their dogs at night without a second thought. I worked from home most nights, sitting at my desk by the kitchen, half listening to a podcast while answering emails. That night was no different, except for the knock. It was soft, barely there, just a tap-tap-tap against the back door. I assumed it was a branch, or maybe a late delivery, but when I glanced at the clock, it was nearly midnight. No one delivered this late. I hesitated before standing up, telling myself it was nothing. Still, my stomach twisted as I walked to the door. I peered through the small window expecting to see a package, maybe a confused driver. But there was nothing. No package. No person. Just the dim glow of my porch light casting long shadows over the backyard. I waited, listening. Silence. Shrugging it off, I went back to my desk. A minute later, the sound came again. 3 slow knocks. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slightly, watching the door from the corner of my eye. Then the handle jiggled. Not aggressively, but deliberately, like someone testing it. A rush of cold went through me. I stayed completely still, heart hammering. Then, as if sensing my awareness, the noise stopped. Just silence again. Too silent. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I forced myself to check the security camera feed. My hands were shaking as I pulled up the app. The front yard was empty. I switched to the backyard, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the darkness, just outside the camera's range. They weren't moving, not even shifting their weight. Just standing there, like they knew exactly where the camera's blind spot was. The longer I stared, the more I realized something terrifying. They had been standing there the entire time. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the screen, but it felt like forever. My mind raced through every possibility. A lost neighbor? A drunk who wandered into the wrong yard? But deep down, I knew better. This person wasn't moving, wasn't knocking anymore. They were just watching, waiting. The worst part? They had to know I was looking at them now, yet they didn't react. That kind of stillness. It wasn't normal. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. My phone was right next to me, but I hesitated. Calling the police felt like admitting this was real, that I wasn't imagining things. Maybe they'd be gone in a few minutes. Maybe it was nothing. But as I reached for my phone, there was another knock, this time quieter, like a taunt. A confirmation that whoever was out there knew I was inside, knew I was listening. That was enough. I dialed 911, barely able to keep my voice steady. The dispatcher was calm, asking me questions. Was the person armed? Could I see their face? But I had nothing to give her, just a shadow in the dark. She told me officers were on their way, but it could take a few minutes. I nodded even though she couldn't see me, and kept my eyes locked on the screen. The figure still hadn't moved. Then, as if the call had triggered something, the security camera flickered. Just for a second. When the feed came back, the figure was gone. My stomach dropped. I scanned the yard, the fence, the back gate. Nothing. But then I noticed something else, something that made my skin crawl. The gate, which I always kept locked, was slightly open. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to let someone in. I felt sick. That gate had been locked, I was sure of it. My legs felt frozen, but my mind was screaming at me to move, to do something. I gripped my phone tighter, whispering to the dispatcher that the back gate was open now. She told me to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and wait for the officers. I nodded again, uselessly, and crept toward the back door. I didn't open it, of course, I wasn't that stupid. But I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. My own breathing was too loud, my heartbeat pounding in my skull. Then, in the stillness, I heard something new. A faint crackle. I frowned, barely daring to breathe. Then it came again. A soft hiss, followed by a little pop. It took me a second to place the sound. Someone was smoking. I moved back to my security feed, scanning the yard frantically. Nothing. No movement. But the sound was close. Whoever had been standing there hadn't gone far. I imagined them just out of sight, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. A sick, twisting fear curled in my stomach. The sound of a cigarette burning meant they weren't in a hurry to leave. They were comfortable. Like they had done this before. The sudden flash of red and blue lights outside nearly made me jump out of my skin. I ran to the front window as the police cruiser pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, scanning my house with sharp, practiced eyes. I yanked the door open before they even knocked. Words tumbled out of me. About the knocking, the figure, the gate, the cigarette. They listened, nodding, then moved to check the backyard. I stood on the porch, arms wrapped around myself, feeling exposed under the porch light. I waited on the porch, shifting nervously as the officers disappeared around the side of my house. The night felt heavier now, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I strained to hear any movement, any voices, anything. A minute passed, then 2. When they finally returned, their faces were unreadable. "No one's there," the taller officer said, but his tone wasn't dismissive. He wasn't calling me crazy. "Your back gate was unlocked, though." I swallowed hard. "It was locked earlier," I whispered. "We believe you," the other officer said. Then he held something up between his fingers. A cigarette, still smoldering, crushed slightly like someone had put it out in a hurry. My stomach lurched. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. Someone close enough to leave this behind. The officers did one more sweep of the yard before telling me to keep my doors locked and call if anything else happened. I thanked them, though the words felt hollow. After they left, I stood at the back door for a long time, staring at the security feed. Nothing moved, nothing changed, but that didn't comfort me. because the worst part wasn't what I had seen. It was what I hadn't. The camera never caught them leaving. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I double-checked every lock, every window. My backyard felt different now, violated, like it wasn't really mine anymore. Days passed. I tried to convince myself it had been a one-time thing, a random creep who got scared off. But then last night I noticed something new. Near the back gate in the dirt was a fresh cigarette butt. It wasn't the same brand as the first one. Whoever it was, they hadn't left. They were just being more careful. I moved into the house in late September, right when the evenings started getting cooler, and the leaves were beginning to turn. It was an old rental, nothing fancy, but it had charm. Wood floors that creaked under my steps, a fireplace that smelled faintly of soot, and a basement I never had a reason to use. I was working long hours back then, coming home well after dark, so I didn't pay much attention to the little things at first. But within the first week, I started noticing something weird. Some nights, when I got home, the basement light would be on. At first, I figured the previous tenant must have left it that way, or maybe there was a faulty switch. It didn't bother me much, I'd just turn it off and go about my night. But then it kept happening. More often than not, I'd walk through the front door and see that dull yellow glow seeping through the crack under the basement door. I was careful too. I started making a point to turn it off every time, flicking the switch near the door frame before heading upstairs. The basement itself was unsettling. Narrow wooden steps leading down to a low-ceilinged space filled with cobwebs and dust. There were no signs of rodents or intruders, nothing to suggest anyone had been down there. But after the third or fourth time of finding the light on again, I started double-checking. Before leaving for work in the mornings, I'd open the basement door, glance inside, and make sure it was dark. Every time, I confirmed it was off. One evening, I decided to test myself. I locked the front door behind me as usual, checked the windows, and made absolutely sure the basement light was off before heading upstairs. That night I slept fine, until something woke me up around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure what it was at first. Maybe a creak of the house settling, or the wind rattling a loose window pane. But as I rolled over, still groggy, something caught my eye. A faint sliver of light. I sat up, blinking the sleep away, and felt my stomach drop. The basement door was open. Not all the way, just a few inches, enough to see that the light was on again. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my pulse quickening. I knew for a fact that door had been shut before I went to bed. The house was silent, eerily so, like it was holding its breath. I hesitated before standing up, every nerve in my body telling me to stay put. But I had to check. I crept down the hallway, each step on the wooden floor sending an uneasy shiver up my spine. When I reached the basement door, I placed my hand against it and gently pushed. The hinges groaned slightly as it swung open further, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones, imprinted in the dust on the wooden steps. I froze. The footprints were unmistakable, deep impressions in the thick dust that coated the stairs, leading downward. My breath caught in my throat as I crouched to get a closer look. They weren't mine. I hadn't set foot in the basement since moving in. My own tracks would have been there, disturbed the dust weeks ago, but these were fresh. A perfect set, one after another, like someone had walked down only minutes ago. My first instinct was to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe they had always been there, and I just hadn't noticed. But the rational part of my brain knew better. Something was wrong. A cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck as I forced myself to look deeper into the basement. The light buzzed weakly from the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows across the unfinished concrete floor. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, Nothing. Just the eerie stillness of the basement, thick with the scent of damp earth and dust. My fingers hovered over the light switch, my instincts screaming at me to turn it off, shut the door, and pretend none of this was happening. But my curiosity, or maybe my fear, won out. I took a cautious step forward. The wooden stair groaned beneath my weight, a sound so loud in the silence that I almost turned and ran right then. But I needed to know. My heart pounded as I descended slowly, gripping the splintered railing, my eyes darting to every shadowed corner. The footprints led straight ahead, stopping just a few feet from an old wooden shelving unit. My stomach twisted. There was nowhere else for whoever made them to go. No doors, no windows, just solid concrete walls. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step closer. The footprints stopped abruptly, like whoever made them had just vanished. I stood there trying to make sense of it. The dust on the floor was undisturbed beyond that point. No signs of someone turning around or stepping back. Just an ending. I stared at the spot for what felt like an eternity. My breathing shallow, my body locked in place. Then, just as I was about to back away, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible, but definitely real. It came from somewhere deeper in the basement, beyond where the footprints stopped. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close. Too close. I stopped breathing. My whole body tensed as I strained to listen, my skin crawling with the undeniable feeling that I wasn't alone. The whisper had been brief, just a murmur, but it had come from somewhere ahead of me, past the footprints, past the old shelves, in a part of the basement that should have been empty. I took a shaky step backward, my foot barely touching the wooden stair behind me. That's when the whisper came again. Louder this time. Urgent. Like someone trying to get my attention. Every hair on my body stood on end. I felt something deep in my gut, an instinct I couldn't ignore. I had to get out. Now. My hand shot to the light switch, flicking it off in one quick motion before I spun on my heel and bolted up the stairs. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, my breath ragged as I scrambled for the door. The moment I reached the top, I slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt into place. I pressed my back against the door, heart hammering against my ribs. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. It felt wrong. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to slow my breathing, trying to make sense of what just happened. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe I was overtired, stressed, paranoid. I told myself anything to keep from losing my mind. But then, just as I was about to step away, something happened that shattered any hope of a rational explanation. From the other side of the basement door, I heard the click of the light switch. And then, the glow returned, seeping through the crack beneath the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with every light in the house on, clutching a baseball bat I hadn't touched since college. I kept my eyes locked on the basement door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Hours passed, the night stretched on, and eventually, the sun rose. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. As soon as it was light enough outside, I grabbed my car keys and left. I didn't even bother showering or changing. I just needed to get out of that house. I spent most of the day at a diner across town, nursing a coffee I barely touched, trying to convince myself I had overreacted. Maybe there was a logical explanation. A wiring issue. A draft pushing the door open. Something, anything, that didn't involve footprints appearing out of nowhere or a voice whispering from the dark. But deep down, I knew the truth. I couldn't go back. Not alone. By early afternoon, I called my landlord. I kept my voice casual, mentioning the basement light turning on by itself, hoping he'd say something that made sense. Instead, there was a long pause on the other end of the line before he cleared his throat. Yeah, You probably shouldn't go down there." His tone was flat, like he'd been expecting this call. My stomach turned. I asked him what he meant, pressing for an explanation, but he just muttered something about old houses having history, and said if I wanted out of my lease, he'd understand. That was all I needed to hear. I went back one last time, just long enough to grab some clothes and my essentials. I didn't check the basement. I didn't check the light. I didn't even stay long enough to pack properly. I just stuffed whatever I could into a duffel bag, kept my head down, and walked out. The house sat quiet behind me, just like it always had. But as I unlocked my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not from the windows, not from the street, but from somewhere below, deep in the foundation of that house. I never went back. I had a friend return my keys for me, and I left town not long after. Sometimes late at night I still think about it. The footprints, the whisper, the way the light always came back on, no matter how many times I turned it off. And worst of all, I think about what my landlord said. You probably shouldn't go down there. I wonder if someone else is living there now. And I wonder if, when they come home at night, they ever notice that glow creeping out from under the basement door. I was in my second year of college when this happened, living alone in a small one-bedroom apartment near campus. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Messy textbooks scattered over the desk, a thrift store couch with a permanent coffee stain, and a window that overlooked the quiet back alley. I had never worried about safety much. The building had a locked entrance, and my unit was on the second floor. Who would go through the trouble of climbing up just to break into a tiny college apartment? That's why I never really thought about locking my window. It was always shut, but locked? Not always. That night I was cramming for an exam, half buried in notes and highlight markers, trying to drown out the distant hum of traffic. My only light came from my desk lamp, casting a warm glow against the walls. At some point, I heard a faint tapping sound. Soft, rhythmic, like nails against glass. I barely noticed it at first, too absorbed in memorizing formulas, but when it happened again, my brain caught up. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. The sound was coming from my window. I turned my head, half expecting to see a branch or maybe a bird. But there was nothing. Just the city lights flickering in the distance, and my window, shut as I had left it. I exhaled, shaking off the tension. Maybe I was imagining things. Sleep deprivation could do that to you. I went back to studying, convincing myself it was nothing. But a few minutes later, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. A shadow shifting. Just a flicker. I snapped my gaze toward the window. My breath hitched. The window wasn't fully shut anymore. It was open. Just an inch, but open. My stomach dropped. I knew for a fact that I had closed it earlier. Slowly I stood up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I forced myself closer. The moment I reached the window, I saw it. Right there, on the narrow ledge outside, was a single muddy footprint. I didn't move. I couldn't. My brain was trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old footprint? Maybe I just hadn't noticed it before? But deep down, I knew that was impossible. It had rained earlier that afternoon, and my window ledge had been spotless when I got home. My stomach twisted as I stared at the smeared dirt, the unmistakable imprint of a shoe sole. Someone had been up here. Someone had touched my window. I swallowed hard and reached for the latch, locking it with trembling fingers. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I forced myself to take a step back, eyes still glued to the glass, scanning the alley below. Nothing but shadows stretching across the pavement. No movement, no sign of anyone. But that didn't mean they weren't still out there, watching, waiting. I grabbed my phone, my hands slick with sweat, and texted my friend Lauren. "Hey, I think someone tried to get into my apartment." 3 dots appeared immediately. "What TF?" she replied. "Did you call the cops?" I hesitated, glancing back at the window. What was I going to tell them? That I heard a noise and found a footprint? That wasn't exactly evidence of a crime. Still, my gut told me something wasn't right. I pulled the curtains shut, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The idea of sleeping alone in that apartment, knowing someone had been close enough to touch the glass, made my skin crawl. I double-checked the locks: front door, bedroom window, bathroom window, then grabbed a knife from the kitchen. It was ridiculous, maybe even paranoid, but I wasn't taking any chances. I tried to focus on studying again, but my eyes kept darting back to the window as if expecting to see fingers curling over the ledge. Every little noise in the apartment made me jump. The hum of the fridge, the distant sound of a car horn outside. My body was tense, my mind racing with possibilities. Who would climb up to a second-floor window? A burglar? A stalker? Or someone just trying to mess with me? I hated not knowing. After what felt like hours of just sitting there, heart pounding, I forced myself to get up and check the alley again. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just an inch. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows over the pavement, stretching between dumpsters and parked cars. At first, everything looked normal. But then, movement. A figure, barely visible, standing just beyond the light's reach. My breath caught in my throat. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I could barely make out the shape of a hood pulled over their head, their features lost in darkness. But what scared me the most was their posture. Too still, too deliberate. Like they wanted me to know they were there. My fingers tightened around my phone as I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I needed to do something. I needed to call someone. I didn't want to call 911. I still wasn't sure if I was overreacting, but I couldn't just sit there and wait for this person to disappear. Or worse, come back. Instead, I dialed Lauren. The moment she picked up, I whispered, "There's someone outside." I heard rustling on her end like she was moving around. "I'm coming over," she said immediately. "Keep your doors locked. Stay away from the window." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Hurry." I stayed in the middle of my apartment, gripping the kitchen knife so tightly my knuckles ached. Every second dragged on, my ears straining for any sound outside. I kept glancing at the front door, half expecting the knob to start turning. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, and I could barely breathe past the lump in my throat. I didn't dare check the window again. I was afraid of what I might see. Minutes passed like hours. Then, finally, a knock. I nearly screamed. But then I heard Lauren's voice. "It's me. Open up." I rushed to the door, fumbling with the lock, my hands still shaking. The moment I swung it open, she pushed inside, scanning the room like she expected to find someone hiding in the shadows. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. I nodded stiffly, but I wasn't sure if I was. We checked the alley together, peeking cautiously through the window. The figure was gone. No sign of anyone. But the muddy footprint was still there, undeniable proof that I hadn't imagined it. Lauren exhaled sharply. "You need to tell the landlord," she said, "or at least call campus security." I knew she was right, but something about it made my stomach churn. Whoever had been out there, they hadn't tried to break in. They hadn't rattled the door or smashed the glass. They had just stood there, watching, waiting. I never left my window unlocked again. In fact, I started keeping a chair wedged against it at night, just in case. Nothing ever happened after that, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that muddy footprint. I think about the tapping on the glass. And I wonder, if I hadn't noticed the window had been opened that night, if I hadn't seen the footprint, Would I have woken up to something standing inside my room?